Time does not heal wounds like these. It only buries them beneath layers of silence until someone dares to look back. For the girl, her life became one long shadow. She bore no more children, at least none that survived. The child she had carried into the world lived longer than most expected, but its existence was never freedom. It was a reminder. Every laugh that wasn't a laugh, every crooked step across the wooden floor, every wordless sound pulled from its throat was the echo of a history that could not be escaped. Some say the child grew into adulthood, though not as we would imagine. Dependent, silent, marked forever by the blood that had betrayed it. Others claim it died young, its grave unmarked, its body returned to the same earth that had hidden so many secrets before it. The truth, like much of this family's story, has dissolved into rumor and fragments, too painful for the locals to retell, too shameful for the records to keep. What remains is not certainty, but a warning. Because this story was not unique. All across America, in pockets of forgotten land, families locked away by geography and silence carried out the same cycle. Cousins became spouses, brothers became fathers, daughters became mothers against their will, and from these unions came children who bore the weight of choices they never made, children who carried in their very bones the proof of what happens when blood is forced to turn in on itself. The girl's name is gone, the child's fate uncertain. The family home has long since rotted, its walls sinking back into the dirt, but the story survives, whispered in fragments, because it asks a question most are too afraid to answer. What happens when shame is hidden instead of stopped, when silence is chosen over truth? The answer is not just in the past. It lingers, waiting, repeating itself in places where no one dares to look. She was pregnant, but no one knew who. And the child that came into the world was not just flesh and blood. It was history itself, twisted and screaming, demanding to be seen. And though the world tried to bury it, tried to forget, its shadow remains. Because some stories do not die, they wait. And when we dig deep enough, we find them staring back at us, reminding us of the cost of silence. The years dragged on. The child did not grow into what one would call a boy or girl. It remained something in between, stunted, fragile, yet disturbingly aware. Its eyes followed people too closely. Its hands twitched in restless patterns, as though some inner storm was trapped beneath the skin. The family kept it inside, away from strangers, but stories always found their way out. Travelers passing through spoke of an unnatural figure glimpsed through cracked windows. They said it stared at them without blinking, its mouth moving as if whispering words no one could hear. By then, the girl was no longer a girl. Time and suffering had carved years into her face that her body had not lived. She rarely smiled, rarely spoke, rarely looked at her child. And yet, she could not escape it. Each night she felt its presence, a weight pressing against her chest, even when it was asleep. Some nights she swore it watched her, its head tilted just enough to make her feel as though she were being judged. The family carried on as they always had, sinking deeper into themselves, refusing to see what was happening. To them, this child was not a warning. It was merely another link in a chain that had long since wrapped itself around their throats, and in their silence, they chose to let it continue. But the outside world was changing. Schools were spreading further into the hills. Doctors began visiting towns that had long been left to rot, and whispers turned into suspicions. How could so many children in one family be born with such twisted features? Why did they never speak of fathers, never name the men behind the pregnancies? The old veil of secrecy was beginning to lift, and with it came the threat of exposure. For the girl, there was no relief in this, only fear. If the truth came out, she would not be seen as a victim, she would be seen as a stain. And so when people asked questions, she lowered her eyes. When neighbors pried, she turned away. Her silence, once a shield, became her prison, and always the child remained, watching, breathing. A reminder that the bloodline had nowhere left to go but deeper into itself. By the time the child reached its second year, the family's secret had grown too large to contain. The noises it made were not the noises of a healthy toddler. Its body remained fragile, its movements stiff, its head grotesquely swollen for its size. When it was carried outside, wrapped in a thin blanket, neighbors stared. Some crossed themselves, others turned away, whispering curses under their breath. In those woods, deformity was not seen as misfortune, it was seen as punishment. Rumors spread quickly, as they always do in small places. Who was the father? Was it her brother, her uncle, her own father? No answer could satisfy, because the truth was that any one of them could have been. The blood had been folded so many times, the line between parent and sibling had vanished long ago, and so the whispers turned darker, crueler. People said the child was cursed, a demon, something not meant to live, and yet it did. The girl could feel the weight of every eye on her, though she never spoke of it. She carried the child when told, fed it when forced, but her silence deepened until it seemed she had been erased from within. At night she often pressed her ear to the wall, listening, not to the voices in the house, but to the silence beyond it, perhaps dreaming of an escape that would never come. The child's presence divided even the family itself. Some saw it as proof of their shame, a burden that should be hidden at all costs. Others treated it as inevitable, another mouth to feed, another body to bury when its time came. But no one dared confront the truth that this was not fate, it was choice. Generations of choices, made in shadows, now carved into flesh. And so the house grew colder. Nights stretched long, filled with cries that no one wanted to soothe. Days blurred into one another until even the girl forgot how many months had passed since her life had been stolen from her. She was not a mother by will, she was a mother by blood, by silence, by the cruel weight of history itself. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The child survived, against every expectation, against the quiet wishes of those who prayed it wouldn't. The infant lived on, and in that house, its presence was like a shadow no one could escape. Wrapped in rags, laid on a straw mattress, it grew, but it did not grow the way other children did. Its head swelled while its body stayed thin. Its movements were jerky, its eyes forever unfocused. Neighbors who caught glimpses said the baby never truly looked at anyone, but rather through them, as if its gaze was trapped in some other world. The mother, still a child herself, seemed to drift further into silence. She cared for it only when forced, her hands shaking when she touched it, her face blank when it cried. Perhaps she was afraid of it, perhaps she hated it, or perhaps she recognized too clearly what it was, a mirror held up to everything her family had become. And yet the family did not end it. They fed the baby just enough, kept it inside, shielded it from outsiders. They did not do this from compassion, but from necessity. To reveal the truth meant to risk exposure. To risk exposure meant shame. And in these hills, shame was worse than death. As months passed, the child began to speak, or what passed for speech. Broken sounds, half-formed words, whispers that scraped from its throat in tones that unsettled even those who had grown used to the unnatural. Some swore they heard it mimic the voices of the house, repeating words it should not have known, sounds it should not have been able to make. Others said it laughed at night, alone in the dark, a laughter that sent grown men stumbling outside, too afraid to return. The girl's belly began to shrink back into the frail lines of her body, but her eyes never lost their hollow look. She rarely spoke now, even to her own mother. And when she did, it was only to ask one question, whispered over and over. Why me, eh? No one ever answered her, because the truth was, there was no answer. She had been born into a bloodline where the walls of kinship had collapsed in on themselves, where the roles of father, brother, and grandfather blurred into one. And when the child was placed in her arms, she was not only holding her baby, she was holding the weight of a history that had chosen her without her consent. The pregnancy was never spoken of. That was the rule of the house, silence above all else. The girl carried her secret beneath loose dresses, her frame already frail, her body shrinking even as her belly grew. When she walked the narrow dirt paths between the trees, neighbors would glance and then look away. Everyone could see, but no one dared to ask. In these hills, asking meant knowing, and knowing meant being dragged into a truth no one wanted to claim. Nights were the worst. The house groaned under the weight of too many people, yet none of them seemed to notice her suffering. Or perhaps they noticed too well. Whispers followed her in the dark, footsteps outside her door, the creak of floorboards that made her clutch her stomach in fear. She was not cared for, she was contained, fed enough to keep her alive, hidden enough to keep questions away. When the pain finally came, it was in silence, as everything in that house was. No midwife, no doctor, only the dim glow of a lantern and the shadow of women who had been through the same ritual before her. They did not comfort her, they did not speak. They simply waited, hands rough and ready, until her body gave way to the inevitable. The child that entered the world that night did not come quietly. The cry was sharp, too sharp, like something torn from the earth itself, and when the women lifted it into the lantern's light, their faces changed. They had seen many such children before, faces shaped by the looping of bloodlines. But this one was different. Its head too large, its jaw too small, its eyes unblinking and wide, one drifting toward the wall, the other staring straight into nothing. The sound it made was not the cry of a newborn, but a strangled gasp, as though its own body fought against existence. The girl turned her face away. She did not ask to hold her child, she did not whisper its name. Perhaps she knew what everyone else knew, that this was not a child who would be given a future. It was a reminder, a living curse, proof of sins buried but never erased. And as the cries filled the night, the walls of that house seemed to press tighter, sealing the secret inside for one more generation. The hills kept families hidden, dirt roads wound upward like veins, cutting through forests so thick that outsiders rarely wandered in. Those who did never stayed long. What they found wasn't just poverty, it was a way of life built on isolation, and isolation, as history has shown, breeds its own kind of darkness. The family at the center of this story lived in a house that sagged against the land, its boards nailed and re-nailed until it seemed more patchwork than home. Their names were scarcely recorded, and when they were, they appeared misspelled, inconsistent, like even the census takers wanted to forget them. Their neighbors, if you could call them that, spoke of them in low voices. Strange, they said, not quite right. Children who didn't look like other children. Men with eyes that crossed. Women who spoke in whispers, who carried bruises, not from accidents but from the hands of men they dared not name. It was a family that did not branch outward. For generations, cousins married cousins, sisters were taken by brothers, mothers by sons. It was not called abuse, it was simply called life. And so the cycle tightened, each child born carrying a face more marked than the last. Wide foreheads, slack jaws, eyes that wandered in opposite directions. Some never spoke at all, though they were old enough to. Others were born with limbs that bent wrong, hands with too few fingers, spines that curled. But the most haunting of all was not what could be seen, it was the silence that surrounded them. No teacher came to these hills, no preacher visited their homes. When babies were born, they were born without witnesses. When coffins were lowered, they sank into the dirt without sermons. The world outside simply chose not to look, and in doing so, allowed it to continue. And in the midst of this silence was a girl. She was quiet, always. Her eyes, a pale shade of grey, looked more at the ground than at anyone's face. She had been a child of this same pattern, born from relations whispered about, but never named aloud. By the time she was 16, her body already carried the wear of a woman twice her age. And when her belly began to swell, no one asked her who the father was. Because in that house, in that family, the answer was already known. It begins with silence. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, but suffocates. Somewhere in the hills of Appalachia, an old house still stands. The wood is splintered, the glass long gone. The rooms empty, except for dust and the ghosts of voices that once echoed through them. It was here, over a century ago, that a child was born, a child who should have never come to be. She carried within her body the bloodline of a family that had folded in on itself for generations, until names no longer mattered, only faces. Faces that grew more distorted with each passing birth, and on the day she was carried screaming into this world, no one could say who her father was, not because he was unknown, but because he could have been anyone, brother, cousin, uncle, even her own grandfather. This story is not folklore. It is not myth. It is history. A history that polite society has worked tirelessly to bury beneath layers of shame, secrecy, and silence. But if you look close enough in the archives of old hospitals, in the censuses of rural towns, and in the whispered recollections of neighbors who never dared speak too loudly, you find it. A tale so horrifying in its truth that it shakes the very foundation of what we believe about family, about morality, about the line between love and possession. She was pregnant, but no one knew who the father was. And when the child came, it was a mirror reflecting every cruel decision, every hidden act, every sin passed down in blood. The child bore the weight of history on its face, a living reminder that some families should never have been allowed to continue. Tonight, you'll hear the story of that child, but to understand it, you first have to step back into the world that created her. A world where isolation wasn't just geography, it was destiny. A world where family trees didn't branch, they circled. Where secrets rotted the roots, and shame was swallowed whole, because to speak it aloud meant condemning everyone you loved. And in this silence, in this suffocating darkness, a question lingers. What happens to a child when the only blood they carry is the blood that loops back into itself?